Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Jimena Blanco, Chief Analyst of Global Risk Insight at Verisk Maplecroft. Jimena, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, your area of expertise is certainly at the top of the headlines, isn't it? Geopolitical risk is only intensifying, isn't it, as we sort of make a start to 2026. You know, obviously there's a lot we can delve into, but I'd like to get your perspective, your sort of overall perspective on whether you feel that we'll start this year in a heightened scenario or compared to a year ago, are things clarifying, even though we got all these uncertainties around trade and tariffs and sanctions, etc.? Or do you think we're in for a higher uncertainty in the year ahead?
Well, I think risks are accumulating, and it's in the nature of the process that we're transitioning right now, which is this shift from a unipolar to a multipolar world. And in that context, we are seeing risks increasing across our data set. So we have seen political risk increase across 136 countries over the past 5 years. Now, of course, that's more pronounced in some jurisdictions versus others. But when we think about, you know, what 2026 could bring, or the future world that business may face, we do see that this has affected most liberal democracies. So when we start thinking about, you know, how can the world shape up, we are seeing these risks coalescing, mounting, and so it will be a challenging year ahead or years ahead when thinking about strategic planning, investment, project deployment for any business.
Absolutely. I mean, let's zero in a bit on you know, one aspect that's dominated headlines in terms of sort of investment risk, supply chain risk, which is, you know, the whole tariff, the US tariff situation, and those different percentages being slapped on and off countries around the globe, and of course, you know, countries in turn responding, negotiating, etc. Without being country specific yet, but how disruptive has the last year been? And again, are we any closer to a clearer sense of reality of where these tariffs are going to end up? We see China has a hiatus till October. We see Europe still responding. And of course, these tariffs are being used as leverage by the US and others. But again, is the tariff situation any clearer today than it was 6 months ago?
Well, I think we have gained some degree of clarity in terms of how tariffs can or will be deployed. And it's not only for economic reasons, but we have also seen them deployed in terms of, you know, diplomatic escalations or exchanges with particular governments, over judicial processes, if we think about the case of Brazil. But I think, you know, they haven't been as disruptive as we expected in terms of economic performance in the United States. But that's not to say that they have not had an impact, right? From a business perspective, they've been extremely disruptive in terms of planning, thinking about supply chains, thinking about where to source in the future. When we talk about supply chains, we're not talking about switches one can turn on and off, right? We're talking about years of planning and investment before a reliable supply chain has been established. But when it comes to economic impacts as well, we haven't yet seen the full cascading or pass-through rates of having to pay for tariffs. And one of the risks that we do face in 2026 is whether governments that have thus far negotiated with Washington may feel that it is time for a stronger response. So I think, you know, everything that's happening around Greenland right now, we need to watch very closely, because this might mark a shift on whether Europe continues down the diplomatic course and the course of dialogue, or whether Europe takes a stronger stance and tariffs, response in kind, or response on specific industries would not be out of the realm of consideration given the context that we're currently in.
Well, I mean, you're based in Europe, in Spain, and so what is your gut feeling about this red line that that the EU has drawn now in regards to Greenland? You know, if America continues to do what it's planning to do, then we're going to be, selling U.S. treasuries, we're going to be putting other restrictions. I mean, do you think Europe can? The main question around it apparently is there's no singular leadership, is there really? And there's disagreement amongst countries. Can they actually use this Greenland threat finally to sort of come together and sort of put their money where their mouth is, if you like? With Ukraine, they've been very much on the back foot, haven't they? So what do you think could shift that dial, if anything?
I think the European Union is both Europe's biggest strength and biggest weakness. On the one hand, because of the market it creates, the political clout it can bring to the union itself. On the other hand, is what you mentioned, right? Disagreements within partners. For us, this is a crucial year because the way we're looking at the world, we're looking at different geopolitical scenarios. Right now, we are living in a world that we would call drift. This is a world of gradual erosion where institutions are losing their strength, where they're unable to broker agreements, right? But the alternative, right, of the world, which is fracture, is one where we're not just talking about erosion, we're talking about breakdowns of the system, right? You're not bending alliances, you're breaking them.
Yeah.
And I think Greenland, in this perspective, is crucial because if we assume that European leaders will carry through with this idea of a move on Greenland means an end of NATO, then we are talking about unprecedented in terms of, a world that most living people have not experienced,
Yeah.
which is a pre-World War II reality in terms of some of the security assumptions that we have held so strongly for the Western Hemisphere. Now, I think Europe in some areas is moving. I think it's been a bit missed in the headlines. The European Union Mercosur agreement, for example, 25 years in the making, it just got signed in the middle of this
Hmm.
escalation in rhetoric between Washington and Brussels and the various governments of Western European nations. And I think that's where Europe is going to try to place its bets, diversify trade partners, seek access to secure critical resources through negotiations. Now, whether the United States can remain the strong partner it has been historically or not, I think the answer lies more in what policy path Washington decides to take versus what Brussels can negotiate.
Okay, I mean, and let's talk about those critical resources. I'd like to talk about the critical minerals argument as well, but let's talk about energy, because that is at the heart, obviously, of a lot of global trade, and it's what keeps global economies running. And we just had the recent example. I'd like your opinion on an analysis, really, on what's happening in Venezuela. I mean, we've had obviously not to repeat what has happened the last 2 weeks. We're very well aware of that. But what would you say is the U.S. intention behind that? Is it to, control Venezuelan oil, therefore have an impact on global energy markets, or is it more of a geostrategic sort of regional, grab for power, negotiating with China and other regions of the world? How do you interpret why they did what they did?
Well, I think, like always, it isn't black or white. The answer is a bit more in one of the shades of gray, right? But I think from an energy markets perspective, the U.S. move on Venezuela shouldn't be taken as a near-term supply event, right? It's more of a signal of how future U.S. foreign policy in the hemisphere may play out. So I think through the actions in Venezuela, Washington has demonstrated it has the political will and the confidence to take this renewed interest in the Americas. Even if we have an oversupplied market, it's looking to turn rhetoric into unprecedented action, right? And the idea is to send a message not only to rivals in the region, like, for example, China, but also to other regional governments that Washington is coming back to the Americas. And so I think from a energy perspective, right, the response from markets in terms of pricing has been relatively muted, and that
Yeah.
really reflects a recognition that, Venezuelan output is constrained by major structural factors, and that any new supply coming from Venezuela, a serious increases in production, will take some years to materialize. And that's assuming that we can overcome a number of hurdles, ranging from the lifting of sanctions to the settlement of sovereign and PDVSA debt, securing operations on the ground, having the regulatory systems in place. It's a very challenging environment. So I think, overall, from an energy
Mm.
perspective, the message is more about, look, Washington is willing to intervene, is willing to intervene in certain markets. But what we're looking at here is a much broader trend towards greater geopolitical presence in the region, much more so than about Venezuela's oil
Yeah.
on its
Well,
own.
so what about the other countries in the region then? Should they be worried? Colombia, etc., Mexico. I mean, how nervous should they be that the US will sort of expand this geostrategic influence, one way or another, through control of certain resources? I mean, is there a need for those other economies to be nervous?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a need for negotiations, and some of those are ongoing, whether we're talking about Mexico and the renegotiation of the USMCA, which is due halfway through this year, whether we're talking about Brazil. But I think there's a significant difference with Venezuela in terms of how the country was an outlier in the region in many ways, not only in terms of, politically within Venezuela, but also the level of presence of certain rivals of Washington within the country.
Yeah.
So whether we're talking about Cuba, Russia, Iran, or China, from a security perspective for Washington, Venezuela represented a threat and a risk that none of the other countries in the region present, even if we're talking about numerous challenges in terms of drug trafficking and security in broader terms within Latin America. So I think it's more, the conversation with other countries is much more nuanced than it could have ever been with
Mm.
Caracas.
What do you think? Does the equation in Venezuela at all impact what's happening with Russia, Ukraine from a sort of negotiating point of view between the US and Europe? Does it change the dynamics on what Europe might do with regards to Ukraine as it tries to resolve things like, its objection to Venezuela or to Greenland, for that matter? Or do you think the Russia-Ukraine situation remains as it is, unresolved? Russia has the upper hand for the time being. I mean, again, where does that put? What do you think Russia's stance will be on that, having seen what the US is doing in Venezuela?
Well, I mean, I think the US chose its timing largely because Russia is obviously preoccupied and busy in Ukraine and cannot respond to Venezuela. From a European perspective, I don't think that developments in Venezuela themselves change much about, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But the
Mm,
response from Europe was also quite muted. Part of it has to do with the fact that European governments had and the European Union were unable to broker a change in regime and transition in Venezuela after the 2024 elections. So I think, Europe did not particularly agree with the Maduro government remaining in place. In fact, they hadn't recognized his regime as legitimate. But at the same time, Europe did not appreciate the manner in which Maduro was taken out of office. So I think these are the nuances that we're going to start seeing increasingly more and more of in the coming years if we continue walking down this gradual erosion of the international system, and potentially breaking it by the end of this decade.
I mean, what would you say China's opinion is on what is happening in South America? It's obviously present investment-wise throughout the continent. Perhaps, does that matter to China more than what's happening in the South China Sea from a US-China relationship? I mean, you have elections coming up in South America as well, and a lot of the countries where China's invested in. What do you think it would be thinking now as it starts 2026 in the context of the fact of its trade and tariffs and its own geopolitical influence in the South China Sea, of course, with regards to Taiwan mostly?
Yes, well, I mean, I can't say what Beijing is thinking because unfortunately I can't read
Yeah.
their minds, but I would expect them to be interpreting this as a more of a return of US foreign policy towards its traditional backyard in Latin America. And, the fact that Latin America would be at the center of US-China competition is something that I have been speaking about now since 2021 at almost any industry trade conference or show I've been invited to, because it is true that, over the past 25 years or so, China's foreign policy has been one of using investment and trade as a way of increasing its diplomatic clout. And there's nowhere where this is, more obvious than Latin America, where many countries over this period have stopped recognizing Taiwan in exchange for,
Um,
recognizing one China. And of course, this has come with a lot of trade and investment decisions. So for anyone watching the region closely, the fact that this escalation is taking place is not surprising. From the Chinese perspective, I think there's also a recognition that Washington alone and Western companies, just beyond the United
mm,
States, cannot in their own replace the level of investment or trade that China has been providing for the region. And I think, there's probably no clearer message than the op-ed that President Lula da Silva just published yesterday, talking about, how the Western Hemisphere is for everyone, for all its residents of the Americas, and how no country will be told who to trade or, who to engage with by another country. And of course, he did not mention the United States directly, but when one reads his opinion piece, it's quite clear that he is pursuing this position, and he ends
yeah.
it by saying to the United States, we're the two largest democracies of the Americas. We are the two largest markets in this region. We should sit down and negotiate. And from the Brazilian perspective, and what I expect to see in the coming years, is to see Brasilia becoming a much stronger vocal player in the international arena as it seeks to deliver something that has been part of Brazilian foreign policy for generations, which is to be an independent leader or the leader of South America as counterweight to Washington's influence and presence in the region. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this in the coming
Yeah.
months.
Well, not just in the region. I mean, Brazil, of course, is part of the BRICS bloc, which is expanding and adding members as we speak. And that is, again, to your point of, a unipolar, world or reorganization of traditional blocs, if you like. I mean, do you see, from a trade point of view, groups like the BRICS and others becoming more and more defined and obviously redefining old trade blocks? Globalization has it died, or are we just sort of having a reconfiguration of that?
Well, let's start by the end of your question. I think globalization as we knew it
Yeah.
is on its way out, but it's a new form of globalization that we're
Mm.
entering, one in which middle powers, whether we're talking about Brazil, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, they're exerting a lot more presence and influence in their respective regions. And of course, groupings like the BRICS have grown enormously. South-South trade now represents
Yeah.
nearly a quarter of global trade, which is a huge shift from the beginning of this century. And so, we're not just talking now about developed economies that had a lot of influence and power, but when we're talking about these large emerging markets that are becoming middle powers, they will have a tremendous role to play, not only in terms of the future of our economies, but also in terms of the future arrangements of multilateral institutions, diplomatic circles. And in a future, we could see this emergence of, more trade archipelagos, if you will, where you have different groupings. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, that are going to reconfigure our supply chains and trade routes.
Okay, I mean, Jimena, just as we wrap up, I wanted to touch on the critical minerals and rare earth argument that has obviously made headlines as well in the last year or so. I mean, this is nothing new. Rare earth resources are have always been there. You know, when there's commodities sort of prices up, they become more of an issue, but they've become very geopolitically more important, haven't they? At least from the US point of view. What is your opinion of that? I mean, how large a market is that? How important is that element of the commodity market as part of these trade negotiations, and how countries might behave?
Well, I think it's become crucial, right? Both for countries, but also from the perspective of companies, because when we think about critical minerals, and sometimes, people think immediately of lithium, but copper is also a critical mineral,
Yeah.
right? And it's a huge market. We have huge established players there, lots of Western and not Western companies operating there. And it's becoming increasingly challenging for companies when looking at new projects. And here is where this volatility is so important. When we're talking about projects in mining, like in oil and gas, we're not talking about 2, 3 year investment cycles. We're talking about projects that are expected to last 20 to 30 years, and then with future technology, even longer. We need stability and understanding whether your investment destination will be geopolitically
Yeah.
aligned with your home country or geopolitically palatable to your home government is crucial for the future exploration, but also development of projects. And I think that's where critical minerals in Latin America as well, because the region is very well endowed with them, will be crucial to determine investment in the future. But of course, we're already seeing this play out in places like Sub-Saharan Africa as well, in the Middle East, right? How companies are deciding to invest is now having a much heavier ingredient of geopolitical considerations than they would have had 15 or 20
Mm.
years ago.
Jimena Blanco, Chief Analyst, Global Risk Insight at Verisk Maplecroft. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. It's been great to
Thank you
have
for
you.
having me.